Something happened at a NATO summit that no diplomatic protocol can undo. Not a treaty violation, not a walkout, not a leaked memo. A gesture. 7 seconds of body language that restructured the Western alliance faster than any war, any tariff, or any election in the last 30 years. The cameras were rolling. Every frame was captured. And what they recorded was not a moment of lost composure. It was something far more deliberate and far more permanent. The mainstream media will tell you this was a diplomatic spat, a bad day between allies, tensions that will pass. But here is what nobody is telling you. What happened in that room was not a breakdown. It was a verdict. And the Western alliance has not recovered because it cannot. Here is the mechanism they are not explaining. Here is what was actually at stake. And here is why Warren Buffett, a man who has watched thousands of negotiations end over 7 decades, says this single moment inflicted more damage on American diplomatic standing than every sanction, every tariff, and every strongly worded statement of the past 2 years combined. The number that defines this moment is not a dollar figure or a troop count. It is this, 340 million. That is how many times the footage was viewed in a single day, not in a week, not across the lifespan of a news cycle, in 24 hours. No diplomatic statement in history has ever traveled that fast. No communique, no declaration, no speech at the UN General Assembly. A gesture moved faster than language, because a gesture requires no translation. That number matters because it tells you the scale of the audience that witnessed the verdict in real time. And an audience that size does not forget. It does not reinterpret. It does not accept a reframing from a press secretary who wasn't in the room. 340 million people saw what they saw, and what they saw was permanent. The question is, how did this happen? And the answer begins not with 7 seconds, but with 48 hours. Imagine you arrive at a meeting where you have participated for decades. You have always had a seat at the center table. You have always been included in the drafting sessions. Your proposals have always been on the agenda. Then one morning, without explanation, your seat has been moved to the far end of the room. Your proposals have been removed from the schedule. The meetings you were always part of are now happening without you. And when you walk into the room, the people who organize this look through you as if your presence is a minor inconvenience. That is the experience that preceded the gesture, not metaphorically, literally. The Canadian delegation arrived at that summit and was systematically excluded from every consequential conversation. Bilateral meetings that Canada had participated in for decades were held without Canadian representation. The committee responsible for drafting the joint statement, which traditionally includes all member nations, was convened as a smaller group, and Canada was not in it. Arctic defense proposals submitted 6 weeks in advance disappeared from the agenda without a word of explanation. The seating arrangement was altered. Protocol that had stood for years was quietly revised, and every diplomat in that room understood exactly what the revision meant. One European diplomat described it afterward as a sustained campaign of humiliation, designed to send a message to Canada in front of the entire alliance. Not a policy disagreement, a campaign, deliberate, systematic, and visible to everyone present. Through all of it, the Canadian Prime Minister said nothing publicly. He attended every session. He absorbed every signal. But in a private conversation with his chief of staff, later shared with Canadian media, he said something that tells you everything about what was coming. He said, "There is a difference between being pressured and being disrespected. Pressure I can absorb indefinitely. Disrespect has a limit." That conversation happened 7 hours before the coffee break. The coffee break is where summits actually happen. The plenary sessions are theater. The working lunches are choreography. The coffee break, where leaders drift into informal clusters and speak without interpreters or official witnesses, is where the real architecture of alliance gets built or destroyed. During that break, a cluster formed. The Canadian Prime Minister was there, alongside the French President and the Norwegian Prime Minister. A conversation was underway. Then someone joined the cluster uninvited, interrupted the conversation mid-sentence, looked at the Canadian Prime Minister and said, in front of witnesses from multiple nations, words to the effect of, "Nobody here takes your country seriously anymore. You have a small country with a big mouth. If it weren't for us, you'd have been absorbed long ago. Maybe spend less time playing tough and more time being grateful." The Norwegian Prime Minister stepped back. The French President went still. The Canadian aides who were present later described a silence that felt like the oxygen had been extracted from the room. But it continued. The additional line, which multiple officials identified as the moment the situation became irretrievable, was something along the lines of your trade positioning, your deals with European partners. We all know that's because you can't compete independently. Your country has never stood on its own 2 feet. It needed Britain to carry it. Now it needs us. You're welcome. This was said in an open room with witnesses from a dozen nations. Not in a private bilateral meeting where difficult words stay contained. Not in a back channel where language can be softened later. In the open, casually, with the confidence of someone who has never considered that the person being spoken to might simply stop listening. And here is what happened next. The Canadian Prime Minister stood approximately 4 feet away, hands at his sides. He said nothing for 2 seconds. His expression did not shift. He did not tighten his jaw. He did not narrow his eyes. He simply looked. And the word that witnesses independently used afterward, without coordination, was the same word every time. Finished. Not angry, not offended, finished. The expression of someone who has completed a calculation and arrived at a conclusion. Then he turned, not sharply, not dramatically, slowly, with the deliberate control of someone who knows exactly what the movement means and chooses to make it anyway. Left shoulder first, then the full rotation of his body until his back was completely and unmistakably facing the most powerful leader in the room. And he walked, not quickly, not slowly, toward the cluster of European leaders on the other side of the space. He did not look back. He did not hesitate. 7 seconds from the beginning of the turn to the moment his back was fully presented. 7 seconds that said more about the state of the transatlantic relationship than 2 years of speeches, press conferences, and bilateral communiques, because words can be disputed and a turn back cannot. Now understand what happened in the 30 seconds that followed. The French president moved first. Within 5 seconds, he stepped away from where he had been standing, crossed the room, and placed his hand on the Canadian Prime Minister's shoulder. He said nothing. He did not need to. The gesture carried its own complete message. Germany's Chancellor followed within 15 seconds. The British Prime Minister across the room caught the Canadian Prime Minister's eye and delivered a nod that 3 separate camera angles captured, later described as the most significant nonverbal communication between the 2 countries' leaders in generations. One by one, without coordination, without a signal, without anyone organizing what was happening, the leaders of the Western Alliance chose a side, and it was not the side of the American president. The photograph from those 30 seconds became the defining image of the summit. On one side, the Canadian Prime Minister, surrounded by the leaders of France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Spain, and Portugal. On the other side, the American president, standing with the Hungarian Prime Minister and a cluster of aides, hand no longer extended, expression cycling between confusion and something harder. The composition was accidental. Its meaning was not. When media outlets placed it beside photographs from previous summits, images of every allied leader clustered around the American president, the transformation of the alliance was visible in a single glance. No analysis required, no commentary necessary. The before and the after spoke for themselves. One major newspaper ran the image on its front page with a 4-word caption: "The center has moved." 3 hours later, at a press conference, a journalist asked the Canadian Prime Minister directly, "Why did you turn your back?" He stood at the podium for several seconds. He looked at the journalist. He looked at the camera. And then he said quietly and with complete finality, "I said everything I needed to say. I just didn't use words." 11 words. No elaboration. No diplomatic hedging. He took no further questions. Those 11 words were trending in 6 minutes. International media described them as the confirmation that the gesture was the message. Not a lapse, not an accident, but a statement delivered in the oldest language available to a human being. This is where the story stops being about a bilateral relationship and becomes something else entirely. In diplomacy, there are thousands of ways to express disapproval. Recalled ambassadors, canceled meetings, suspended cooperation, strongly worded statements that consume entire press cycles. All of these share one characteristic: they use language. And language, by its nature, can be interpreted. It can be softened in translation, hedged in future meetings, slowly rehabilitated through the patient machinery of formal diplomacy. A turned back has no language. It cannot be misread. It cannot be walked back by a handshake at the next summit. It does not say, your policy is unacceptable. It says one thing, this relationship is over, not paused, not frozen, over. In a language older than any diplomatic tradition, the primal register of the human body that every person on earth understands without translation. This is the distinction that makes the moment irreversible. Not its visibility, though the visibility is total. Not the 340 million views, though that number ensures the footage will outlast everyone in it. The irreversibility comes from what the gesture communicated versus what every previous response had communicated. Every prior Canadian response attacked a policy. This rejected a person. Every prior Canadian response said, your terms are unacceptable, but you remain a counterpart I will negotiate with. This said, you are no longer someone I will face. That distinction is the difference between friction and fracture. Warren Buffett has spent 7 decades watching negotiations end. He has observed that they never end with words. They end with gestures, a door closed, a handshake withheld, a signature not placed. He has argued that the reason gestures carry more weight than words in high-stakes situations is structural. Words require interpretation, and in the gap between utterance and interpretation, there is always room for revision. A gesture exists in the visual record, which is neither fallible nor forgiving. It plays the same way every time it is viewed. In 50 years, when historians watch this footage, they will see exactly what the leaders in that room saw. Nothing will have softened. Nothing will have been diplomatically laundered by time. His analysis of the specific mechanics of this moment is precise. He describes a concept he calls option value, the worth that a relationship holds simply by remaining open, because an open relationship preserves the possibility of resolution. As long as two parties are facing each other, the relationship has value regardless of how damaged it is, because it can still be repaired. What the gesture did in 7 seconds was destroy that option value. It told the American president and everyone watching that the relationship itself, not its current terms, not its recent trajectory, but the relationship, was no longer worth maintaining. And when the most powerful country in the world discovers that its closest ally has reached that conclusion, on camera, in front of every allied leader, there is no policy adjustment that recovers it. Then NATO fractured. Not over defense spending percentages, not over burden-sharing formulas or troop deployment thresholds. Over 7 seconds of body language that forced every member nation to confront a question nobody wanted to ask out loud. Is the American president still someone the Western alliance can organize itself around? The joint communique went unsigned. For the first time in the alliance's history, Canada refused to co-author any document with the United States. France and Germany supported that position. The drafting committee dissolved. The Secretary General convened an emergency session. Diplomatic language for a crisis that the normal mechanisms of the alliance could no longer contain. The session ran for 4 hours. No statement was issued afterward. The silence was the most honest communication the alliance produced that day. One ambassador was reported to have said in that session, "We are not here to discuss a bilateral dispute. We are here to ask whether this alliance has a center." After this morning, I am not sure it does. The traditional group photograph, the image of allied unity that every summit produces, became a visual record of the fracture. The Canadian Prime Minister positioned himself at maximum distance from the American President, with French and German leaders physically between them. The contrast with every previous summit photograph was impossible to ignore. 3 bilateral meetings between European delegations and the American delegation were cancelled that day. 2 were rescheduled as trilateral meetings that included Canada but excluded the United States. The architecture of allied diplomacy was being rebuilt in real time, and it was being rebuilt around a different center. The international reaction confirmed the scale of what had occurred. China's foreign ministry noted, in carefully chosen language, the deep divisions now visible within the Western alliance. Russia's foreign minister described the moment as the natural consequence of coercion, language that every allied capital understood as an invitation to recalibrate. Japan's prime minister said that the strength of any alliance depends on mutual respect, and that his government was watching developments with concern. Australia's prime minister was more direct. If the closest bilateral relationship in the Western world can deteriorate to physical rejection at a summit table, no alliance relationship can be considered secure. Inside the United States, the reaction divided along familiar lines. The political base interpreted the moment as disrespect directed at America. But the foreign policy and national security community reacted differently, with alarm that in some cases bordered on grief. A retired four-star general said publicly that he had watched the visible collapse of everything his career had been dedicated to building. He said it did not collapse because of Canada. It collapsed because the conditions were created in which America's closest ally concluded that the American president was not worth facing. A former director of the CIA said what he had watched was not degradation. It was severance. And severance of the country's closest alliance on camera at a NATO summit is a national security event that the country is not prepared for. The White House attempted to reframe the gesture as Canadian disrespect directed at the United States, but the footage made that framing impossible to sustain. What the world watched was not aggression. It was not a tantrum. It was a leader absorbing a sustained personal insult with complete composure over multiple exchanges in front of allied witnesses, and then quietly and deliberately concluding that the insult was the final data point in a calculation that had already been running for 48 hours. The visual communicated restraint, not hostility, dignity, not provocation, and every attempt to argue otherwise required ignoring the 90 seconds of provocation that preceded the turn. Provocation that was also on camera from multiple angles with audio. So here is where things stand. After 48 hours of systematic exclusion and 90 seconds of personal humiliation, the Prime Minister of Canada turned his back on the President of the United States in a room containing the leadership of the entire Western Alliance. 32 heads of state watched. The leaders of France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Spain, Portugal, and the United Kingdom moved to his side. The summit agenda collapsed. The joint communique went unsigned. The Secretary General convened an emergency crisis session, and 11 words became the most quoted statement in international diplomacy. The question that every allied capital is now asking, quietly in private, in the sessions that do not appear on official schedules, is the same question that one ambassador asked in that 4-hour emergency meeting. Does this alliance still have a center? And if the center is no longer Washington, what are the structural implications for every collective defense commitment, every mutual obligation, every framework that was built on the assumption that the United States would always be the organizing principle of Western security? That question did not exist before 7 seconds of body language forced it into the open. It exists now. It will not close again simply because the next summit produces a signed communique and a group photograph where everyone is smiling, because the footage will still be there, playing the same way it always played, showing the same 30 seconds of allied leaders choosing a position and the same isolated figure on the other side of the room. And every leader, every diplomat, every defense minister who watches it will be performing the same calculation that the Canadian Prime Minister performed in that coffee break, weighing the cost of what they witnessed against the benefit of continuing to pretend they did not see it. Warren Buffett's final observation on this moment is worth sitting with. The most powerful thing the Canadian Prime Minister did in 2 years of escalating bilateral tension required no policy instrument, no economic lever, no legal mechanism. He simply stopped pretending the relationship still functioned. And in stopping, he forced everyone watching to stop pretending alongside him. That is not a diplomatic incident. That is a structural realignment. And structural realignments, once visible, do not reverse. The American president attempted to demonstrate that his leadership was unchallengeable. Instead, he was defined by 7 seconds of silence and a back. He attempted to humiliate a counterpart in front of the alliance. Instead, he watched the alliance walk to that counterpart's side and leave him standing alone. He tried to show that American power made certain conversations consequence-free. Instead, he showed the world what it looks like when the closest ally concludes that the conversation itself is no longer worth having. 11 words. Every leader heard them. Every diplomat understood them. And the question they pose, whether American leadership is still something the Western alliance can face, remains for now unanswered. That is the number to carry out of this analysis. Not 340 million views, not 7 seconds, not 48 hours of exclusion, 11 words. Because those 11 words are the summary of everything that has happened and everything that comes next. They did not open a negotiation. They closed one. And in diplomacy, when the closing line is delivered in the oldest language human beings have, the language of the turn back, there is no rebuttal. There is only the question of what everyone else does next. What do you do when the alliance you rely on has already begun to answer that question without you?